Hello. The Imperial Agents are an unusual faction in 40k, able to field their own distinct fighting force, but also offering up a cavalcade of wildcard odd-job zealots who can pitch up, muck in, and hang out with other forces of the Imperium. So where and when and why did these flavourful characters first emerge in 40k? The 10th edition Imperial Agents Codex includes some of the most dangerous operatives available to the Emperor. Grey Knights, Sisters of Battle, Inquisitors, Assassins, and so many more. And many of them date back to the very origins of 40k, Warhammer 40,000, Rogue Trader, and the evolutions that came with the second edition of the game. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're building Warhammer Armies Imperial Agents. Building Warhammer Armies is my series where I look at the real-world development history of factions in 40k, Warhammer Fantasy, and Age of Sigmar. There are videos in the playlist about Genestealer cults, or Ratty Skaven Ratboy Ratrats if you want to find out how they first emerged in the games and then evolved and changed over time. If you want to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon or my Element Game affiliate links in the description below, and please don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the video. Imperial Agents can be used in 40k in a couple of ways. You can either field a full army themed around one of the secretive Ordos of the Inquisition, or you can cherry pick some of your favourite and most effective units from across the entire faction to put into an Imperial army. The reason for that is that they have inherited lots of different sub-factions from many, many different editions and versions of the Imperial Agents forces over the course of 40k's history. But before we get into that, let's take a look at what the Imperial Agents today are described as. The 10th edition Codex Imperial Agents is centered around the Inquisition, the invisible hand of the Emperor that safeguards the Imperium from insidious threats across and abroad. Inquisitors operate with a high degree of autonomy and authority, able to draft into service units, companies, and entire armies from other branches of the Imperium forces to enable them to complete their important work. Work that might see them hunting aliens, demons, or heretics, military factions, Inquisitors, priests, assassins, Grey Knights, Battle Sisters, Navigators, Rogue Traders, Deathwatch Marines, and Adeptus Arbites can all be marshalled as an inquisitorial army, or as allies to other forces of the Imperium. In a regular Building Warhammer Armies episode, I am able to trace, relatively simply, the chronological development history of a faction, taking in some of its inspirations and stepping from edition to edition, iteration to iteration. Now, that's not always quite so simple, but when it comes to the Imperial Agents, we are dealing with something altogether different. And that's because the Imperial Agents is actually constructed from any number of different codexes and editions, army lists, factions, sub-factions, squads, all sorts of stuff. This is such a complicated journey. It's almost like the Astronomicon's London Underground tube map. There are so many stops along the way. So, in order to build a reasonable perspective on the journey that has brought together all of those Imperial Feds and Narcs, Zealots, Oddjobs, and Henchmen, we're going to do things slightly differently this time around. I will still be dwelling on the monumental moments, the highlights of that history, but it won't be in quite as much detail as usual. Like any rough ride through warp space, you're going to have to brace yourselves for a little bit of chop. We have to start with the firmest ground it's possible to stand on in real space. Warhammer 40,000, Rogue Trader. Many of the concepts that underpin the Imperial Agents of today can still follow their line all the way back to the source, with Rogue Trader offering up the first appearances of the Adeptus Arbites, Imperial Assassins, Navigators, Psychers, and the Inquisition, the Arbites. And I am pretty sure I am mispronouncing that word, but I just prefer the way Adeptus Arbites sounds compared to Adeptus Arbites or Arbiters. Anyway, the Arbites draw massively on the inspirations of 2000 AD and Judge Dredd. The astropaths of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica and the Imperial Navigators have a lovely bit of Dune within them. And then you've got the Imperial Assassins, who report to the Lord and Masters of the Assassins and up onto the High Lords of Terror. They are highly trained, stolen from feral worlds and taught for decades in the secret schools. And whilst they already make use of their finger guns and polymorphine, there are no formal temples in the fluff just yet. The Adepta Sororitas, or Sisters of Battle, are described as an order of devotional warrior women, organised along similar lines to the Space Marines. And of course, we get the Inquisition. Inquisitors are special agents of the Imperium, free-roaming troubleshooters bound by no law or authority. Every Inquisitor is empowered to investigate any possible or potential threat to the future of humanity, whether that threat comes in the form of political aggression, administrative inefficiency, or genetic deviation. They sound like a bunch of seriously impressive individuals, and I think when you see the included example, you can't help but agree. Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau is a renowned Inquisitor who tirelessly works to expose the psychic misdeeds and genetic deviance of Imperial criminals. I've not uncovered exactly what it is just yet, but I'm pretty convinced that Obi-Wan Sherlock Clouseau is a reference to something. Why don't you leave a note in the comments if you've worked it out? There are no bounds to the Inquisitor's field of operation. Alien plots, mutation, corruption, crime, and incompetence all come under his jurisdiction. Inquisitors usually operate alone, but where necessary they will requisition, hire, or purchase men and materials to help with their duty. Many Inquisitors maintain a small personal staff to aid them in their work. His work through the galaxy has earned the Inquisitor the name of witch hunter, torturer, and worse. Where necessary, he is both of these, and things more terrible, for any means justifies an end so vital and so endangered. With the exception of our fun friend Clouseau, this description is pretty much on the money and would stay the description of the Inquisition and the Inquisitors through the development of 40k. So, things would only get more interesting and more detailed as time progressed. White Dwarf enormously expanded the Imperium over the life of Rogue Trader, evolving and reshaping it and its various branches into something closer to what we'd recognise today, and there were miniatures available to represent the likes of generic Inquisitors and members of the Ordos Malleus. And then releases like the Space Hulk expansion Genestealer gave us more detail about units like the Grey Knights, psychically attuned Space Marines on the hunt for Xenos and Heretic alike. It's really not possible to talk about the history of the Inquisition and their Imperial Agents in 40k without spending at least a little bit of time talking about the first full-length novel ever written for the 40k setting, Ian Watson's Inquisitor. The book takes the idea of autonomous Inquisitors and their retinues tackling unusual threats across the Imperium and cranks the threat level to midnight. Despite its quirks and its flaws, the book is a seminal work in 40k history, which we recently covered in my book club if you're interested in finding out more, as well as building the foundations of the Adeptus Assassin Temple, showing how Inquisitors, Astropaths, Navigators, and Psychers might work within the 40k setting. Watson also goes on to explore the Inquisition itself, shedding a little light on the unfathomable workings of a secretive organisation composed of fractal conspiracies and mind-bending half-truths that threaten to overthrow all of humanity. Yep, it's probably a little bit more relevant today than one might have expected or wanted, especially as the stories and concepts even found their way into modern 40k and the Horus Heresy stories of 30k. When I interviewed Ian Watson, he talked to me a little bit about how he went about writing for 40k.
Why did I choose to write about an Inquisitor and an Assassin? Well, it seemed like a good idea for an adventure novel, which it really was, a space opera adventure novel with a kind of outsiders. I wanted to be outrageous and extensive. So in the way that a space opera writer like Van Vogt was in Voyage of the Space Beagle.
The second edition starter box for 40k included a book called the Codex Imperialis, and within it you would find updated details about the Adeptus Arbites, the Grey Knights, the Adepta Sororitas, the Imperial Assassins, the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, and of course, the Inquisition. This book, along with the Army Lists book in the 2nd edition box, the so-called Black Codex, would update many of the organizations that fall under the banner of Imperial Agents today, firming up the foundations around the organizational structure of the Imperium, building on Ian Watson's work and reshaping the nature of the Inquisition and its major subfaction, the Ordos Malleus, as well as expanding on the temples of the Assassins. For many people, it's the 2nd edition where modern 40k begins, and you can see that in the Imperial Agents for sure. As you would expect, White Dwarf continued to play a major role in expanding the 41st millennium. There would be plenty of articles about lore and units, factions, and all sorts of new details, including stuff about the Adepta Sororitas, or the Sisters of Battle. Now, all of the Imperial Agents' sub-factions probably deserve their own deep dive histories, but I would argue that perhaps none deserve one more than the Sisters of Battle. After appearing in Rogue Trader and then their entry in Codex Imperialis, the Sisters of Battle, the militant arm of the ecclesiarchy fighting to ensure faith in the imperial cult, would receive a full codex for the 2nd edition, written by Gav Thorpe. In the pages of that codex, though, it would make clear that players might be best served using the Sisters as allies for Space Marines or Imperial Guard, likely because there were so few Sororitas models actually available. In the 3rd edition, Sisters of Battle would find themselves folded into another codex, which we'll come back to, and then their next dedicated codex wouldn't be so much a book, but rather an article, appearing in White Dwarf for the 5th edition. For the 6th edition, they would get a full codex once again, under a new name, Codex Adepta Sororitas, though this one would be exclusively available digitally. That has all changed for the 8th, 9th, and 10th editions, where they've been pretty well served, and continue to have a close relationship with the Imperial Agents under the auspices of the Inquisition. Speaking of the Inquisition, it's probably the right time to dwell for a moment on the 3 major subfactions within it, the Ordo Majoris. The first is the Ordos Malleus, who were responsible for demon hunting within the Imperium. Then there is the Ordo Hereticus, who were all about tracking down heretics, mutants, and unsanctioned psychers. And then there is the Ordo Xenos, who were all about finding out the insidious influence of the alien on humanity. These 3 subfactions would be explored in considerably more detail with the release of a dedicated game about them. This would be the Battle for the Emperor's Soul, a game called Inquisitor. The 54mm skirmish miniature game, released in 2001, was designed by Gav Thorpe with concepts by John Blanche. This narrative wargame featured small bands of warriors, often led by an Inquisitor, and though it was a relatively short-lived experiment in a new scale for Games Workshop and a new way of playing in the 41st millennium, its focus on storytelling in the shadowy corners of the Imperium would have a long-lasting, supersized impact on 40k. When I interviewed him, Gav Thorpe told me a little bit more about creating the game's world within the 40k setting.
But so early on, the idea was it's actually going to be Inquisitors versus Chaos Magi. Or Dave Gallagher did some pictures as well of just a couple of like an Inquisitor and a Chaos Magi guy with these big claw hands and stuff like that. But actually, the reality came down to it like, well, we've got a range of 15 miniatures. If you split that in 2, that's not very many. You can't have 2 sides basically. We can't have a side of Chaos and a side of Imperials. We need to do something else. So Rick and I Rick kind of came up with the idea of Puritans and Radicals, but then and factions, but then I delved into that and turned it into the Inquisitor background sort of thing. So everybody, in theory, could be used by everybody, although obviously certain troop types and things, certain character types lent themselves better to Puritans than it did to Radicals. But in theory, you'd get an Inquisitor and then of all of those different henchmen, you could pick whichever ones you wanted and convert them and blah, blah. So there were 3... Of the 15, there were 3 Inquisitors, which of hitting different archetypes. We had the Tech Priest, who could either be like a follower or lead a warband, and then we also had the Space Marine, who was supposed to again lead kill teams and things, not be a follower.
I've already explored the making of Inquisitor in a dedicated video, but there is one aspect of the story that I didn't get into too much detail about: the creation of a loose organization within the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines. This is an organization comprised of the coolest, edgiest, hardest, most mariniest of Marines, the Deathwatch. Specially selected like a punnet of Aldi sable grapes, the Deathwatch are comprised of the best Marines from any and all chapters, organised into small companies and kill teams, with the autonomy and flexibility to hunt Xenos threats across the Imperium. Writing on his blog in 2016, Gavthorpe talked about the origins of the Deathwatch and their role in Inquisitor. It was decided from the outset that there would be a Space Marine included. The main thrust of Inquisitor was to present a range of 54mm miniatures for modelers and painters, and it would be lunacy not to include one of Warhammer 40,000's flagship warriors. Given the level of detail on the model, it would be better if we did not single out one chapter to represent, but gave collectors the option of painting a warrior from any chapter. So that became the brief. A Space Marine that could equally lead an Inquisitorial warband or operate alongside an Inquisitor of no particular chapter. My original idea for the Deathwatch was to portray something different to the Grey Knights, a chamber militant of the Inquisition, and the Sisters of Battle, a convenient affiliation. My concept was not for a single organisation like a Space Marine chapter, but a series of historical arrangements between many Space Marine chapters and agents of the Ordo Xenos, codified but not rationalised. A single brother of the Deathwatch could be dispatched on a particular mission, calling upon those ancient agreements. He might spend years or decades on that duty until relieved or killed, perhaps never heard from again. Or he might be sent into the depths of a hive world to root out a genestealer cult, the enemy within de jure, or to cleanse a Hrud infestation. Over the course of that duty, the Deathwatch warrior might, like an Inquisitor, accumulate necessary companions. The rest of that post, much like the rest of Gav's blog, is really worth a read. I've included a link to it in the description below. The Deathwatch would go on, like the Sisters of Battle, to play a major role in the forces of the Inquisition, which we'll get to right about now. 40k's 3rd edition would do away with the relative restraint with which Codex production had been handled in 2nd. There would be a lot of new codexes released, including some that dealt specifically with the Inquisition and its agents. Each of the Inquisition's 3 Ordo Majori are aided in their endeavours by a chamber militant, often dispatched under the auspices of an Inquisitor on a specific mission, and these military forces would form the bulk of some of these new 3rd edition codexes. The first book of the Inquisition was Codex Demon Hunters, written by Andy Chambers, Phil Kelly and Graham McNeil, and released in 2003. Within its pages, we'd find out all about the Ordos Malleus and their chamber militant, the Grey Knight Space Marines. White Dwarf and subsequent chapter-approved anthology books had further developed the Grey Knights from their earliest appearances, and these special psychic marines would only feature more heavily in the 40k lineup from here on out. The Demon Hunters Codex also introduced a special character, Lord Inquisitor Cotias, who received a seemingly unbeatable model alongside his inquisitorial retinue. The second book of the Inquisition was Codex Witch Hunters, written by Andy Hoare and Graham McNeil and released a year later in 2004. This book was dedicated to the Ordo Hereticus and their empire-fearing warriors. A fair amount of the Codex was given over to the Adepta Sororitas, as they act as the chamber militant for the Ordo, but there was also plenty of detail about the temples of the Officio Assassinorum. Assassins had in fact received their own Codex in 2nd edition, and then a free White Dwarf follow-up was released for 3rd edition, and though they have never been an army in their own right, they could always add some extra punch to another Imperial force. And then there was to be the 3rd book of the Inquisition, Codex Alien Hunters. Intended to be a codex covering the Ordo Xenos, the Alien Hunters book never released, but if you want to believe that it was real, just check out White Dwarf 303, where there was evidence that it was being worked on, until it was redacted and a conspiracy of silence ensued. At least there were articles about the Deathwatch, but alas, the Xenos threat ran amok for the foreseeable future. In the 4th and 5th editions of 40k, the Inquisition and its associated military forces seemed to play less of a central role, at least when it came to codex releases, but they weren't absent from the universe by any means. Grey Knights got their own codex in 5th, and the Sisters of Battle got that White Dwarf article thing. But then, in the 6th edition of 40k, there would be something new. Codex Inquisition. Released in 2013, the Codex Inquisition book was initially only available digitally. In its binary, you would find updates about all 3 Ordo Majori, as well as several of the smaller Ordos, like the Ordo Kronos, the Guardians of History, and the Ordo Sicarius, who were responsible for keeping the Officio Assassinorum in check. The book even featured the rogue trader favourites, the Jacero weaponsmiths, marvellous Maurices of the 41st millennium. Codex Inquisition would be reissued for the 7th edition of the game as a physical printed product. And then in around 2015-2016, Games Workshop would return to a realm that it had abandoned for some time, the board game, and it would use the opportunity to repackage some new Imperial agents. Assassinorum Execution Force is a fun co-op or solo game that makes use of the Imperial assassins, and I enjoyed it so much I made myself a little video about it. There was also a game called Deathwatch Overkill, which featured a squad of Deathwatch Marines tackling a Genestealer infestation. The latter game was something of a sneaky pre-release for miniatures from the new Codex Deathwatch, which provided rules for fielding the lone wolf best at what they do, don't get in my way, I work alone Marines as an entire army. And they would get an updated Codex for the 8th edition as well. And when Fantasy Flight wanted to add Space Marines to their Warhammer 40,000 roleplay, it was Deathwatch that they built their game around. But like a well-fed lictor too big to hide behind that small picket fence, there would be something else bursting at the seams and failing to stay hidden in the shadows of the 7th edition. The very first Codex Imperial Agents. In just 136 pages, the book somehow managed to cover the Adeptus Mechanicus, Aeronautica Imperialis, Adeptus Astra Telepathica, Adepta Sororitas, Deathwatch Space Marines, Grey Knight Terminators, the Legion of the Damned, the Officio Assassinorum, and the Inquisition as well. This was the coordination, the collection, the collation of all of those other Codex books that had covered the different factions and sub-factions from across the Inquisition for the past 7 editions of the game. And whilst there was not a great deal of space for lore and background, there were a lot of datasheets, no doubt making this a big hit with members of the Ordo Scriptorum. Over the following editions, there would be dedicated codexes for the Grey Knights, the Sisters of Battle, the Mechanicus, and the Deathwatch, but it's only now with the re-emergence of the Imperial Agents at the Emperor's hand that these Imperium weirdos have found themselves back together under one roof. It has been an interesting journey, I think, for the Imperial Agents, one of contraction and expansion, contraction and expansion, and I think that has actually charted something of the development philosophy of 40k through its many editions. In Rogue Trader, a game defined by its expansive, unexplored world and its role-playing elements, the assassins, telepaths, and inquisitors were all perfect player character style avatars, individualistic and unique despite their shared mission and investment in safeguarding the Imperium. With the 2nd edition, things were formalised considerably, but these were largely still the backwater factions, small collections of specialists that could be crafted into highly unique, flavourful armies by hobbyists who would convert their own miniatures and models. 3rd edition changed the game, and the focus on the grimdark corners of the Imperium was ramped up. Games like Necromunda and Inquisitor suggested that the grubby underbelly of the universe was its most interesting aspect, and at the same time there was a push for more factions and more codexes. Necrons and the Tau emerged from without, demon hunters and witch hunters arose from within. For a couple of editions, the focus seemed to be on the classic factions who had come to dominate the game, but with 6th edition, there would be renewed exploration of the lesser considered factions. From 7th onwards, there has been a fervent desire to add more factions and sub-factions, mining ever deeper into the different potential armies of the 41st millennium, searching for interesting units and characters, and of course, things to sell. So there you have it, a high-speed warp flight through the history of the Imperial Agents, a very choppy, very rough exploration of the different contributing codexes and releases that have brought us to this place. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I would love to know which of those many codexes you have enjoyed the most. Is it the Imperial Agents themselves, or one of the smaller sub-factions, the Chambers Militant that help support them in battle? Please let me know in the comments down below. And if you are going to be buying some Imperial Agents or any other hobby supplies this weekend or anytime soon, you can use my Element Games affiliate link. And if you did enjoy this video, please consider liking and subscribing and sharing it with your friends. It's a great help for the channel. If you want to support the work I do here long term, please consider checking out my Patreon via the link in the description below. It's the only way I can continue to do this, and you get access to early and exclusive content, regular updates, monthly giveaways for the rest of the year, a Discord, and lots of other cool stuff as well. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Listen, I would have told you more secrets of the history of the Imperial Agents, but with a name like Sorcery, I'm pretty confident the Inquisition is already gunning for me.